The wind was sharp that evening, cutting through the empty plains like it carried secrets from far away. The sun was gone, but its last light still clung to the horizon, painting the sky in deep red and gold. Inside the small ranch house, Thomas Hale sat by the table, a half-empty coffee cup cooling in his hands. He'd been alone for so long. The silence had become a second skin. The sound came sudden. Not a coyote, not the creak of old wood. It was footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps across the dry dirt outside his door. His brow furrowed, and he set the cup down. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry, and that in itself was strange. When a knock came, it wasn't timid. It was firm, almost commanding. Thomas opened the door, and there she was. A woman, maybe in her late 20s, dust on her coat, strands of hair sticking to her face from the wind. Her eyes were steady, unflinching, the kind you didn't dare look away from. Before he could speak, she said it, cold and clear. "Kill me or save me." No trembling in her voice. No plea. Just the kind of certainty that comes when someone's already lived through the worst. Thomas didn't move, didn't answer. He searched her face for a sign. Fear, desperation, maybe even a lie. But she gave him nothing. Just those words hanging in the air, heavy as a gunshot. In the distance, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of something else. Hooves, maybe, or trouble. Whatever it was, Thomas knew one thing. Nothing about his life would be the same after tonight. Before that night, Thomas Hale's life was a straight line. Every day started the same way, before the sun, before the roosters, before the world seemed awake. He'd pull on his worn boots, drink a cup of bitter coffee, and step outside into the quiet. The land stretched far in every direction, flat and endless, broken only by weathered fences and the slow roll of the hills in the distance. The ranch was all he had left, though some days it felt more like a burden than a home. His father had built it, his mother had filled it with warmth, and his brother had once promised they'd run it together. But the years had a way of taking things, sometimes slow, sometimes all at once. His parents gone, his brother buried too young, and a woman he once thought he'd marry now, just another ghost in his memory. The house itself was quiet in the way old houses get quiet. Not peaceful, but empty. Dust settled on the shelves where family photographs used to stand. The kitchen smelled faintly of stale bread and old coffee grounds. The only real sound came from the wind against the walls and the occasional restless pawing of his horse in the barn. Thomas spoke to almost no one. A trip into town every couple of weeks was enough, supplies, feed, maybe a beer if he felt like being around people. But the talk in town was shallow, and the smiles felt rehearsed. He didn't let anyone close enough to ask questions. His days were a repetition of small labors, mending fences, checking the herd, fixing what needed fixing. Work kept his hands busy, but it couldn't fill the space that loss had carved in him. And so the years blurred together, seasons changing, cattle coming and going, storms sweeping in and out, until one night, without warning, there was a knock on his door. Until a stranger stood there in the wind, her voice carrying a sentence that tore straight through the stillness of his life. "Kill me or save me." Thomas didn't ask her in right away. He just stood there, one hand on the doorframe, studying her like a man might study a storm cloud on the horizon, deciding if it meant rain or trouble. She didn't flinch under his stare. She just waited, the cold air swirling around her like she had all the time in the world. Finally, without a word, he stepped back. She walked inside. The room felt smaller with her in it. Though she carried no bag, no belongings, nothing to explain where she'd come from or how far she'd traveled. He motioned toward the chair by the table. She sat, keeping her coat on, her hands resting on her knees. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice low, and used a conversation. She hesitated, then nodded once. He poured her coffee and set out what little he had left from supper, bread and a strip of dried meat. She ate slow, like someone who knew better than to trust free meals. Thomas didn't press her for answers, but his mind turned over questions. Who was she running from? Why had she chosen his door? And what in God's name had she meant by those first words? Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The old ranch house groaned in the cold. Somewhere out in the dark, A coyote gave a long, lonely howl, answered faintly by another far off. "You can stay in the spare room," Thomas finally said. "It ain't much." Her eyes lifted to his, sharp and unreadable. "Thank you," she said quietly, as if the words cost her something. He showed her the small room down the hall, a narrow bed, a single blanket, a lamp that flickered when the wind pressed against the walls. She stepped inside without looking back. Thomas returned to the table, sat, and listened to the sound of her footsteps fade. The quiet crept back in, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It had weight now. He tried to tell himself he didn't care who she was. Tried to believe she'd be gone by morning. But deep down, he knew better. Strangers didn't come this far out unless they were desperate. And desperate people, they carried trouble behind them like a shadow. That night, as he finally lay in bed, he thought he heard something faint beyond the wind, a far-off sound that didn't belong to the night. Morning came slow, with pale light spilling over the plains. Thomas was already up, stoking the stove, when he heard the floorboards creak. She stepped into the kitchen, her coat still on, eyes scanning the room like she was making sure nothing had changed overnight. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded, wrapping her hands around the cup when he set it in front of her. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the soft scrape of a chair as she shifted her weight. "You got a name?" he asked finally. There was a pause before she answered. "Elena." Her voice was steady, but her eyes stayed fixed on the steam rising from her cup. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Thomas didn't push further, not yet. He knew better than to chase answers. People gave them in their own time, or not at all. Still, he could see the edges of something in her face, a tightness in her jaw, the way her gaze flicked toward the window every few minutes, like she expected something or someone to come riding in. Around midday, Thomas was outside checking the fence when he saw her standing by the barn, staring out toward the horizon. Her shoulders were tense, and when he got close, he realized she wasn't looking at the land. She was watching the sky, as if she feared what it might bring. "You running from the law?" he asked plainly. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Not the law," she said. Then, after a long breath, "Men, dangerous ones." She didn't give details, but the way she said it told him more than the words themselves. There was history there, something dark, something she didn't want to name. That night, over a quiet supper, she told him bits and pieces. She'd left a place she never wanted to see again. There had been threats, shouting, a gun fired into the air. She'd been warned she wouldn't get far, but she'd made it here, and she seemed both surprised and unsure what that meant. Thomas listened, saying little. He wasn't sure yet if he believed all of it, or if it mattered. He just knew there was fear in her voice when she talked about the past, and that fear was real enough to take seriously. Before she went to bed, Elena looked at him in a way that made him pause. "I don't want trouble to find you," she said softly. "It usually does," he replied. And for the first time, she almost smiled. Almost. The days that followed felt uneasy, like the air before a storm. Thomas went about his work, mending fences, hauling feed, but he could feel it, a tension just beneath the surface. Elena moved through the house quietly, keeping to herself, yet her eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. On the third morning, he spotted something that set his jaw tight, a single set of boot tracks in the dirt road, fresh, leading toward the ranch but turning back before reaching the gate. Whoever had been close enough to see the house, then left. That wasn't a good sign. When he mentioned it over breakfast, Elena went pale. She didn't say a word, but her hands tightened around her coffee cup. Later that day, Thomas rode into town for supplies. The general store owner mentioned seeing two unfamiliar men the day before, one tall, one broad-shouldered, asking questions about a young woman traveling alone. They'd bought whiskey and left without saying much else. By the time he got back, the sun was low and the wind had picked up. He found Elena in the barn, brushing down his mare with slow, deliberate strokes. She didn't look up when he entered. "They're looking," she said quietly. "They won't stop." Thomas didn't answer. He took the brush from her and set it aside. "Then we'll be ready." That night, he checked the rifle he kept above the mantel. loading each round with the same care a man might give to sharpening a knife before a fight. He moved extra firewood against the doors, nailed shut one of the side windows, and hung an old lantern outside, a trick his father had taught him, to make the house look watched even in darkness. Elena noticed every move he made, but said nothing. Around midnight, the coyotes were louder than usual, their howls sharp and restless. Thomas sat at the table, wide awake, staring at the dark beyond the window. Somewhere out there, the riders were closing in. Whether they came tonight or the next, it didn't matter. He could feel the ranch changing, becoming something more than just land and fences. It was turning into a line in the sand. And he knew one thing for certain. Once that line was crossed, there'd be no going back. The morning came quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the land was holding its breath. Thomas stepped outside, scanning the horizon. That's when he saw them. 2 riders in the distance, dark shapes moving slow but steady toward the ranch. He didn't rush. Instead, he went back inside, took the rifle from above the mantel, and checked the chamber. Elena was at the window, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. "It's them," she said. Thomas gave a short nod. "Stay inside." The riders drew closer, their horses kicking up little clouds of dust. When they reached the gate, they stopped. The taller one spoke first, his voice carrying across the open land. "We're looking for a woman. Came through here a few days back. You seen her?" Thomas stood by the porch rail, rifle in hand, but not raised. "Don't think I have." The second man leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "Mind if we take a look around?" "I do," Thomas said. His tone was flat, calm. Something in his stillness must have told them he wasn't bluffing, because they glanced at each other before dismounting. That was the moment Thomas raised the rifle. "Back on your horses," he said evenly. The taller man smirked. "You sure you want to do this, friend?" "I'm sure." The smirk faded. His hand drifted toward his hip. Thomas didn't move, but his eyes locked on the man's. A long moment passed, the kind that feels like it stretches for miles. Then, from inside the house, the door creaked. Elena stepped out. "Stop," she said. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "It's me you want." Thomas didn't look back, but his grip on the rifle tightened. The taller man's smirk returned. "There you are." Elena took a step forward, then another, until she was standing just behind Thomas. "You'll have to go through him," she said quietly, almost like it wasn't meant to be heard. The men studied Thomas for a beat longer, then swung back onto their horses. "This ain't over," the taller one said, spurring his horse around. As they rode off, the weight in the air didn't lift. Thomas lowered the rifle, but didn't let go. "Elena," he said slowly, "it's time you tell me everything." They sat at the table long after the riders were gone, the smell of gun oil still hanging in the air. Elena's hands were clasped together, her knuckles white. "I worked for them," she began, her voice low. "Not by choice. They ran things in the town I came from, gambling, debts worse. I owed them money, and when I couldn't pay, they made me useful. I saw things I shouldn't have. And one night, I heard too much. They told me I wouldn't live to tell it." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "I thought I could keep running forever. I was wrong." Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Then you stay here, as long as you need." Her brow furrowed. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to," he said. "I know the kind of men they are, and I know I ain't handing you over." The days that followed were quiet, but not in the lonely way they used to be. The riders didn't return, though Thomas kept his rifle close. Elena began to move around the house more, helping with chores, cooking meals. The silence between them became easier, warmer. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the land in gold, they stood by the fence line, watching the cattle graze. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere far off. "You saved me," she said. Thomas glanced at her. "You gave me a reason to." For a long time, neither spoke. The world around them felt still, the kind of stillness that meant the worst had passed, at least for now. When they finally turned back toward the house, the light was fading, and the shadows stretched long across the plains. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but they knew one thing: they wouldn't be facing it alone. Some stories stay with you long after the dust settles. If this one did, let me know in the comments what part struck you the most. And if you want more tales of the Wild West, of courage, loss, and the choices that change everything, make sure to subscribe. Out here, every story's a gamble, and you won't want to miss the next one.